Tom's paper raises the question, so if Madhyamaka has an anti-realist metaphysics, what are the consequences for ethics? That is, if you think of ethics as he frames it here, or moral philosophy as not only saying what we ought to do, which he would say is a moralizer if you say nothing more than that, but why we ought to do it. What does Madhyamaka anti-realism offer that's peculiar, that's unique, that could help us justify why we ought to act ethically? So one possible answer, he suggests, is that Madhyamaka can give us a better account of interdependence and interconnectedness, and therefore that would motivate us or justify morality. He suggests, though, that in fact that's what every Mahayana school does, and so there's nothing peculiar about Madhyamaka anti-realism. He says that in fact a lot of Madhyamaka moral philosophy is no different from the rest of Mahayana philosophy. But he's still interested in getting at this question of what it can offer that's peculiar. And so he sets up the problem by suggesting that it is a problem because Nagarjuna himself wants to say that anti-realism, his form of anti-realism, in fact doesn't make any change to morality. It still leaves us all the morality that we already had. It conforms to the conventional world. So he then moves on to Bronwyn Finnegan and Koji Tanaka's argument that, in fact, Madhyamaka anti-realism cannot justify a morality, cannot justify anything about how we ought to act ethically. And the only thing that it can do is to suggest in a kind of private reason within the Sangha why we ought to act morally as Buddhists, not as rational thinkers, but as Buddhists. Tom, however, disputes this. He says that Bhava Viveka and a number of others, in fact, do employ rational strategies in arguing with non-Buddhists to justify why Buddhist morality, in fact, is authoritative, is something that is compelling. And Tom says, well, one can think that maybe they were just wrong, if that's what the argument is, but that argument would also have to generalize to any account of anti-realism, Western, Eastern, wherever, and Bronwyn and Koji do not, in fact, make that argument. And Tom wants to argue that, in fact, anti-realism, Madhyamaka anti-realism, does not constrain moral justification, that it is possible for prasangikas to draw on their peculiar anti-realist arguments to justify morality. However, this raises a problem, he suggests, because prasangikas have a methodological constraint to conform to conventional truth. That is, conventional truth should basically follow, he's arguing, what the world's ideas and intuitions are. And so what that means is that any justification that a prasangika would have would basically be going along with what the world takes as authoritative. And for the most part, that's going to depend on a realist metaphysics and epistemology. What he says is, the prescriptive accounts of the other schools, accounts that seek largely to change what the world thinks in order to better conform to entities, end up for the prasangikas being a reformulation of realism. So this is how he sets up the problem. If you are committed to conventional truth being guided by the intuitions of the world, then if you have a account of morality that's grounded in conventional truth, it will not draw on, or it'll be in tension with, Madhyamaka anti-realism. So He gives a couple of examples where Aryadeva and Chandrakirti, in fact, do argue along conventional terms, say with the four illusions, that even thinking along the lines or within the framework of the conventional world, there's still a mistake being made within the conventional world, and therefore you can use conventional reasoning to justify morality. So quoting Aryadeva, he says, when someone entertains doubt concerning the imperceptible things taught by the Buddha, actually, that's I was just writing all these notes in the previous one. So what he argues is that the authors try to show, Aryadeva and Chandrakirti, that the world's superficial attitudes on these matters are in conflict with its deep-seated intuitions. If the world reflected, it would recognize the four illusions as indeed illusions. So the main claim that he's making there is that Aryadeva and Chandrakirti are seeking to rationally justify Buddhist ethics. But, Tom argues, that while some karmic consequences can be justified according to the conventions of the world, for example, if you live by violence, you will die by violence, there are many inaccessible facts, many karmic consequences, which you simply need an omniscient being the authority of an omniscient being to justify. And if you are drawing on the authority of an omniscient being, then you arrive at a situation where if you don't acknowledge that that being in particular is omniscient, the justification falls apart. So what Tom says is that the way that Aryadeva and Chandrakirti get around this is by arguing in terms that they set up as conventional, but in fact, according to Tom, are not going to be persuasive. And those terms or that argument is that because the Buddha has presented arguments that are compelling with regards to metaphysics, epistemology, and other areas that we can debate about, therefore, he has demonstrated his authority, and we ought to take on faith the claims that are made about inaccessible facts of karma. So Aryadeva says, and this is Tom quoting Aryadeva, when someone entertains doubt concerning the imperceptible things taught by the Buddha, he should develop conviction in these very things on account of emptiness. So the account of emptiness was persuasive. That account can be justified according to pramana theory that would be accessible to everybody. Therefore, the Buddha has authority. Therefore, we should trust the Buddha on facts of karma that we don't all have access to, but the Buddha's omniscience has been demonstrated. Tom, as you might imagine, does not find this argument particularly persuasive. And he suggests that, well, I'm going to skip that whole part of the argument, but you can imagine what it is. He does devote a full page to it, or two. So, but then he does say that Dharmakirti seems to have recognized these same critiques of that he's developing, that you can't take the inaccessible facts on the authority of the Buddha, and you can't think that anybody outside of the Sangha is going to be persuaded by that. Still, he says, Dharmakirti did believe that these kinds of arguments on faith were efficacious for Buddhists. And even as Dharmakirti acknowledges that they're not going to be justificatory, that they're not going to be effective outside the Sangha. Tom is critical of Dharmakirti here for shifting from private to public and public to private. He thinks it's illegitimate in rational discourse, and he draws on Owen Flanagan's term, epistemological protectionism, where you cordon off certain areas which are not open to rational debate or critical debate, and you say, well, these areas I'm going to justify according to faith on the authority of an omniscient Buddha. And he rejects that, as you can imagine. He ends by arguing that if Buddhist ethics, at least if Madhyamaka ethics, is actually going to engage in a modern philosophical critical debate, it has to leave behind what he regards as fundamentalism. He calls it a fundamentalist ethics, which is basically an appeal to sacred text, an appeal to the authority and omniscience of the Buddha. And he says that, quote, ethics has to become humanized and to quite a degree secularized. So that's his argument. It's largely a critique of the last 2,000 years of Madhyamaka ethics, or at least of Madhyamakas being able to provide anything that's actually peculiar to Madhyamaka to the justification of ethics. I feel funny giving a critical comment when Tom, in fact, is not here. So I'm going to raise a question that we can then discuss during the discussion. At the beginning of his paper, Tom makes the claim that there is no overarching Western moral theory that can cover all of Buddhist ethics. And I think it's a claim that is deeply compelling. I think a variety of moral theories can be drawn on to help interpret, to illumine, to disclose aspects of Buddhist ethics, features of Buddhist ethics. But I agree with him. I think, though, that for some of the same reasons that we should be careful about interpreting all of Buddhist ethics according to utilitarian categories or virtue ethics categories, I think for the same sorts of reasons we have to be careful of setting up the problem that he addresses in his paper as he does. He's drawing on Western moral philosophers who argue that you need to give reasons for certain kinds of justifications for ethical claims, which essentially is a kind of prescriptive ethics. But that's only one kind of Western form of ethics. Hume has been brought up a lot. Obviously, there are connections with Hume and Madhyamaka. It seems to me that you could easily argue that, in fact, what Buddhist ethics is about, or begins with, is some kind of claim, I take it this would be something most of us could agree on, that ignorance leads to suffering. And suffering includes not just the suffering of the self, but a kind of insensibility to the suffering of others. That's not really a claim which most Buddhist thinkers feel needs to be justified. Suffering is bad, and it's simply a given. I take it that you can interpret somebody like Chandrakirti or somebody like Shantideva as giving a descriptive account of ethics. In giving a descriptive account of ethics, you don't need the same kind of justification that some forms of more prescriptive forms of ethics require. And if that's the case, you could then argue that Madhyamaka and Madhyamaka anti-realism, Madhyamaka epistemology and metaphysics, in fact does have something deep and profound and peculiar to offer to ethics, namely a much more, an insight into the nature of reality, which in fact will aid the practitioner, or the person who follows Madhyamaka, in ethics, and that ethics will be about suffering, will not be prescriptive, and doesn't need the same kind of justification that Tom is asking for. One of the things that I've been thinking about in listening to the discussion this morning is that it may be the case that approaching Madhyamaka epistemology from the perspective of virtue epistemology, I don't know if anybody writes about Madhyamaka epistemology and virtue epistemology, but if one were to draw on those resources, that might be even more helpful in giving an account of Madhyamaka ethics, such that what Madhyamaka has to offer that's peculiar actually could be a resource to Buddhist moral thought and not something extraneous and superfluous, as Tom seems to be suggesting. So, thank you.